to come and speak to you guys on a few topics over the next few months. And today we're going to start with something that I believe is massively important. I know Lee does as well, and it's something that's getting talked about a lot in the health and fitness industry at the moment. Unusually for the health and fitness industry, a lot of the information coming out about it is positive and usually at least in the right ballpark of the information that should be putting out. But whereas a lot of people talk about the benefits of sleep, and we'll start with that today, I'm really here to take that to the next level and talk about some more of the more effective sleep strategies, and that will help you in fat loss. But it won't just help you in fat loss; it'll help you with recovery from exercise, general mood state, and kind of mental performance. So, if we start with that, obviously sleep is massively important for our physical health. Over the course of our day, we accumulate fatigue, we break down cells, we break down tissues. Our organs are working really hard, our brain's working really hard, and we need that downtime to fully recover. And for a lot of people, they just simply don't get enough sleep, or they believe they get enough sleep, but they don't actually get adequate enough sleep to return our body to this state of what we would call homeostasis. So homeostasis is just a state of the body being in a kind of ordered, organized, fully rejuvenated state. And it's natural to get out of homeostasis over the course of the day because most physical activities or mental activities will do that, but we do need times to just let the body calm down. So we do need times to let the body just kind of calm down, regenerate, recuperate, so that we can attack the next day. If we don't do this over time, this is going to put stress on our body systems, especially the immune system, our endocrine system. So if people already have issues around hormones and things like that, this is going to make that even worse. And if people are prone to illnesses, injuries, all of that kind of stuff has got strong associations with inadequate amount of sleep. And as I'm sure you're all aware, it's very difficult to concentrate on being healthy and active and eating well if you're constantly feeling run down and constantly feeling tired. So this kind of ties in with the mental health. The physical is the mental to a certain extent, like our brains are an organ, and that organ, like anything else, gets tired and fatigued. And considering how important our brain is to ourselves, it's the one thing where we do tend to, I guess, abuse it with the things we put in our body. So things like alcohol, too much alcohol, drugs, lack of sleep, all of that stuff, as much as we might not want to admit it, has a significant impact on our mental health. And sleep does definitely, this has been shown time and time again in research that if we don't get enough sleep, it affects not only our physical performance and our mental performance. It has a direct impact on things like symptoms of depression, our cognitive function, our ability to perform and make good decisions. So if you're thinking about weight management, for example, that if we're not making good decisions and we're tired and we're fatigued and we're putting our bodies into a stressed state and we're not allowing it adequate time to recover, then it's completely natural that the body is going to start to crave extra food, extra fuel, maybe that it doesn't need or want. That it does need and want, but only because we're not getting enough sleep. And then things like appetite dysfunction, hunger dysregulation, all of that stuff becomes increasingly common. So it means it's really, really difficult for people to then lose weight. On top of that as well, even in people who have gained weight, which is associated with sleep patterns, it then also increases the risk of health complications from that weight gain, because if we've got increased stress on the body, then, well, obviously, the word stress says it all, right? If we've got increased stress on the body, as well as we're putting stress on the body physically, as well as the emotional stress or stress caused by sleep deprivation, then those things like cumulatively add up to increase risk of things like cancers and cardiovascular disease and things like that. So obviously the physical, mental health all tied together, but a lot of people really, I don't think, realize the impact that it has on weight management, and that how developing some good solid sleep strategies, or at least being able to identify where areas of concern for sleep are going to be hugely important in terms of overcoming those things, seeking the right kind of help and support. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is something people don't really talk about, which is kind of quality of life. it's one thing to kind of get through the day and be heavily reliant on coffee and just kind of, use stimulants or whatever it might be and just get through each day hanging on by the skin of our teeth and to the end of the day and just trying to survive through it. But part of this process is that, life is hard enough without making it even harder for ourselves. And with good quality sleep, this enables us to have a higher quality of life. So it makes difficult tasks easier. It allows us to complete more of those difficult tasks, and it allows us to do those difficult tasks with a kind of energy and vigor. So I think as a kind of a first question, I'm trying to preempt some of the questions here that people might ask, is like, well, how much is a good night's sleep, and how much sleep do we need? So there's two kind of components to this. First is about sleep quantity, so how much sleep do we need, and the next is about sleep quality, and that's kind of how well we sleep. So things like alcohol might help people sleep, but it will reduce our sleep quality. It stops us getting into those really deep sleeps where a lot of the rejuvenation processes take place in the body. And in terms of duration, we need to really be looking at getting at least 7 hours a night sleep. And some people might say that's impossible, okay? And there are certain situations where, it's going to be more challenging, like shift work, or if people have got young children that are ill, or just, very young children that are waking up in the middle of the night for feeds and stuff like that. Of course, there are caveats to that. But we also, for a vast majority of people, there is also definitely a pattern of habits that they fall into around sleep that they believe means they get adequate sleep, and they actually don't. And there are a few tests to check this. So the first one is, like, are you waking up of a morning feeling refreshed? Now, it's natural if you wake up in we sleep in different. I'll take a step backwards. So we sleep in cycles, and if we wake up in the middle of a sleep cycle, like a deep sleep cycle, it's quite often that we might feel a little bit groggy and tired, but usually that will lift within, say, 10 or 15 minutes of being awake, and we feel energized and refreshed. So it's quite normal to wake up feeling a little bit tired, but that should dissipate. However, if you're waking up and then you're needing coffee immediately, and you're needing coffee all morning to function through the day, and don't get me wrong, I love coffee. Have coffee right now. It's important that if we're just surviving on synthetic energy, as it were, that's probably a big indicator that if you can't get through the morning part of your day without needing coffee, then that's probably one sign that you're not getting enough sleep. Another is in terms of in terms of appetite regulation and hunger. If you're noticing that you feel like really highly stressed and overly anxious of a morning, which could be increased with coffee, if we're adding on to that stress of not getting enough sleep with extra caffeine, if we're waking up, if we're in that kind of like constantly craving sugary things first thing of the morning, that probably means we're not recovered properly. It probably means we're in a higher stress state. So this is where higher stress state. So this is where we really have to become really aware of how we sort of feel. How we feel around foods and how we feel around our energy levels, and being very self-aware with those things to kind of be able to, I guess, be honest with ourselves and cut the BS about how much or lack of sleep may be affecting us. So for a lot of people, the first thing to change something is to admit that it may be having a bit more of an impact than they might realise. I believe this for a long time personally, that I could survive off 6-7 hours a night sleep, and there was times in my life where that was something that I kind of had to do when I was like working in long hours as well as trying to study, and I had to kind of sandwich it in. But ultimately I do look back and think, if I'd have made more time for sleep, I'd have probably been more productive and felt better in the hours I was awake. So yeah, a lot of people will hear this and go, I can just survive off 5 hours, 6 hours a night sleep. And it's like, can you though? And I think it's about just being honest about that. Some people can, but they are a very, 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 very rare subset of people who can exist in that state. And I will talk about that in a minute and how we can identify those people a little bit. So sleep problems, as I'm sure you're aware, can be caused by all kinds of issues, and we've got two kinds of types of stress that can cause it. So one is kind of like more of a chronic stress. So a chronic stress might be something which is like a big, heavy emotional weight, which is going to play on our minds for months or long periods of time. So it could be something like if you've got exams, it could be something going through divorce, it could be that you're ill yourself, or there's the death of a loved one. All of these things are going to naturally naturally occur in the course of our lives, and all going to have an impact on our desire or ability to want to sleep. And if we fall into things like a more depressive state or a state of low mental health, then obviously our sleep patterns get disrupted and we fall out of these patterns. Whereas then if we've still got other life commitments with family or work or whatever it might be, we then become tired because our sleep patterns aren't falling into cycle with our working patterns and our commitment patterns, let's call it that. So I think that the problem with those things, obviously we have to accept that in life bad things are going to happen to us, whether it's us or somebody else, and those things are going to cause stress, and there is a likelihood that those things are going to affect our sleep. The real issue with those kinds of things for a lot of people is, even if there is a natural period of time where sleep might be disrupted, is that we can kind of hold that trauma. We can hold that kind of the physical trauma, the mental trauma, but also we fall into these bad sleep patterns and these bad sleep habits, and on like a kind of like a subconscious level rather than the conscious level, even if those issues have been resolved, we still have this kind of this worry and this stress and this underpinning mood, shall we call it, which can mean that we do still keep struggling with sleep, even if on a conscious level we felt like we've dealt with those stresses, or we felt like we've processed those stresses, whatever it might be. So that is fairly common. So quite often, and we'll talk about this, that for those kinds of things where we can't necessarily, we've been through periods of large and sustained stress, even if we feel like those things are dissipated, that's where developing strategies towards like therapy type strategies and really unpicking and identifying the real key causes in what's causing us to struggle to sleep become increasingly important. But again, if that sounds a bit vague, don't worry, it's intentionally vague at this point, because we will move on to how we how we identify and deal with some of those things as well. So I think the most common form of lack of sleep, or delayed going to sleep, or sleep disturbances, which is where obviously we might fall asleep at a regular time. However, we also wake up frequently in the night, struggle to get back to sleep, have bad dreams, all of that kind of stuff. Are these kind of acute stresses that we have day to day. So, the boss at work is having a go at us, the kids are having a hard time at school, or struggling at school, our husband's not being very supportive, but we're having difficulty to have chats about it. Our partner isn't communicating very well, or has made you late for work because they forgot to put petrol in the car. Like all of these things that are, some of them are quite big obviously, but some of them are quite small things, and over the course of the day we get this kind of like, imagine you've got like a stress cup, and over the course of the day we get an accumulation of these little stresses that just add up, and by the end of the day we've got so much that's been on our to-do list that we haven't done because we've not been organised, and we've not had structure, and we've not had systems. But even if we've had those structures and we had those systems and those things that keep us on top of our stress or our tasks that cause us stress, the problem becomes that we have other external influences on that, which then cause us to end up in a high stress state, even if we're doing our best. So that's that constant switching on of our part of our endocrine system called corticosteroid system is where we get these high levels of stress hormones like cortisol, and we're constantly in this kind of high stress state, which does two things. One, it will affect our ability to sleep, because stress normally means we've got something we need to resolve, and our bodies see it that way. And the other is that over long terms, see it that way. And the other is that it will, like when we're in this constant this high release of stress hormones, we then will drive towards wanting to eat more foods, craving more sugary foods. A lot of people think they tend to undereat when they feel stressed. What tends to happen is, it's not that they necessarily undereat. Some people do, but it's not like they necessarily undereat. It's that their eating patterns shift towards more of a grazing behaviour, so they become less aware of what they eat. So they might think they're not eating their 3 square meals a day, for example, so they're not eating as much, but they will be grazing on, crisps, donuts, biscuits all day long, and all of a sudden they've racked up 3,000 calories without paying much attention to it. So that's where the lack of sleep causes stress causes lack of sleep, and we get into this really vicious cycle of poor sleep, high stress, poor food control, And unless we can get a rein on that, even the most stoic, mentally resilient of people is really going to struggle to restrain their food intake. So the first thing we have to do to deal with that, which isn't something I talk about today in terms of the specific sleep stuff, is if you're the kind of person who doesn't have much systems and structures in your life, who doesn't have, to-do lists and schedules and things, and I'm sure Lee will talk about this more with you guys, but you don't have some kind of strategies for coping with the inevitability of the stresses of modern day life, then we're always going to be, one step behind in terms of reaching our goals for that reason. And then there's two other things which I haven't given a nice big long spiel on there because I don't really want to talk about them too much today, because one of them I'm going to come back to, and rather than a sleep thing. So, for example, if you've had injury or illness, there's certain things where you're probably going to want to go and speak to your GP or a relevantly trained medical professional on that, because if you've had an injury, for example, that's causing you pain, there's probably an element of needing to get that pain under control and manage that pain. There's no sleep strategy is going to necessarily help with that. If you had like a broken leg and that's causing you to sleep awkwardly, for example, and on certain illnesses as well, it's natural that if you're waking up and you're like hot or sweaty, flus and fevers, that is something which is largely out of your control to a certain extent without medical intervention. So the reason I don't highlight those is because I don't put them into the same categories as the kind of the more chronic stresses, life stresses like that I talked about before, and the more acute stresses, because these things are a little bit more of things that actually on some levels they're more out of our control, but on other levels they're more in our control, because things like medication, pain medications, and getting the right support can actually help reduce those. And obviously once that period of illness or injury has subsided, then we can get back to regular sleep patterns. However, that might still also tie into what I was saying before about long-term disturbing life events, particularly if you had like a really severe illness or injury, like if that's disrupted your sleep and you're still carrying the trauma from that, then obviously that can kind of tie in with the first point on the list there, which is that can kind of stay with you, and it might take you a while to overcome that, or it might require extra help to overcome that. And then the final one there on that is hormonal changes, and obviously one of the things I'm going to talk about is the menopause, and hot flashes are something that is really common with that, and that's hormonally regulated. So yes, that can have a significant impact. Like lack of sleep disturbances are reported in a large proportion of people who are going through the menopause, but I'm going to come back to that another time because that's a topic all within itself. However, what I would say is that even though that is a very different situation, there are still some commonalities and some strategies that I'm going to talk about that will help with those things. And what we should do is put some baseline habits and behaviors in place in order to make sure that we are giving ourselves the best possible chance. And actually some of the advice for this is still, like I say, is highly relevant to people going through menopause or have got other kinds of hormonal disruption which may be affecting their quantity and quality of sleep. So I want to talk first about this idea of like sleep hygiene. These are the basics. If you're not doing the basics, and people will say, well, it doesn't apply to me, people will find all kinds of reasons or excuses, depending on your perspective, to not do these things, or they'll say it's impossible. Okay, well, I would challenge you, if this is you pushing back against me in this virtual space, I would challenge you to think about what you can do to maybe implement, if not all of these things, like a vast majority of that list, and really do sit down and think and strategize about which ones of these that you can actually have maybe not the perfect system in place, but an improved system in place, just to see the benefits that has. And one of the things I would say with every strategy that we talk about today is that you have to give it an amount of time. You can't just expect to do it for 1 or 2 nights and all of a sudden things just become, rosy in the garden of your sleep. It's something that we need to be persistent with over a period of time. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. I'm going to put this in a guide as well and pass that over to Lee so you can have this in a slightly more longer form and like downloadable PDF version. So the first one is sticking to a consistent sleep schedule by going to bed and waking up at the same time every day. Like, if you sleep differently of a weekend than you do of the weekday, for example, if you're constantly playing catch up of sleep of a weekend, you're never going to get into good sleep patterns of during the week, and you're going to get into this cycle of being deprived of sleep during the week, when you should need more sleep, because that's when we usually need to be more productive. And then another weekend, we stay up later, we go out, we party, whatever it might be. Maybe we don't party anymore, not at my age anyway. But we get into habits of staying up later, maybe watching those couple of extra episodes of Netflix. And again, even if we are having a slightly later night, we need to really try and get up at the same time every single day. So that might sound a bit counterproductive in terms of surely it's getting enough sleep, and that's fine, but we've got to sometimes take a little bit of short-term pain for long-term gain. So if you're not already going to bed at a reasonable time, going to bed at a time to give you enough time to get a reasonable amount of sleep, then you're already fighting a losing battle. If you know you have to be up at 6 a.m. every day, and you're not going to bed till midnight, then you've lost before you've even started, because there's no way you can physically get enough sleep in that time period. So we want to be getting at least 7 hours a night sleep, ideally, at least, where possible, unless, like I said, it's being mediated by things that are out of our control to a large extent. And if you're struggling to get to sleep, the next thing we have to do is to create a bedtime routine. So it could be that we just read a book, we could listen to an audio book, we could take a bath, it could be doing some kind of very gentle activity, meditation, things like that help us de-stress, unwind, and start to act as like a pre-signal to our bodies to tell us that, look, we're done with today, we're going to sleep. If you are in bed at night, watching TV, using electronic devices, doing things that are going to stimulate your brain, or potentially see something that then triggers that anxiety, stress, or worry, checking your emails before you go to bed, immediately before you go to bed, that's going to be a problem. So it's quite common for me to talk about this stuff, and it sounds like it's common sense, and these are things that you may have heard before, but then there's a difference between something being common sense and actually meaningfully implementing a strategy to deal with those things. And people just don't do that. I have to, even as I talk about this, and fairly well educated on this subject, I still have to catch myself falling into those patterns and habits. So one of the things that I did was I just took the TV out of my bedroom, because I got into the habit of just turning it on when I was in there as like background noise. I got into the habit of making sure that I put my alarm on the other side of the room, so that I'm a big snooze button here, right? So there's things that you can look at to make sure that, like, when the alarm goes off of a morning, you don't just roll over and go back to sleep. Now, this is an interesting one, because a lot of people will use alcohol kind of because it acts as a central nervous system suppressant or depressant. So what that does is, if we've had a stressful day, alcohol will sort of cool. So if we've had a stressful day, alcohol will soothe our central nervous system, if you will. And I don't mean soothe necessarily in a positive way here. It's just that it reduces our central nervous system or brain activity, and that gives us the illusion that we are calmer and more relaxed. And so alcohol, even if it's just a glass of wine or a couple of glasses of wine, can become an incredibly useful tool for people to help unwind at the end of the day. The problem with this, though, and this is where there's a kind of individual response, if you're drinking wine or beer or whatever it is to unwind at the end of the day, it's calories that you're probably better off consuming in food anyway, because alcohol is quite calorific relative to the quantity. It's quite energy dense. The other issue is that you might feel more relaxed, it might help you go to sleep, but the quality of sleep is reduced. So it's just something to watch out for, and something you can experiment with, is if you do tend to consume alcohol of an evening, is to really try and keep like a sleep score or a sleep diary of how well you think you've slept after that. Because like I said, if you may have found this if you've consumed like large quantities of alcohol, that you wake up the next morning like bright and early, and you feel kind of like slightly like alert and awake, and you feel like you sort of feel okay, but there's just something not quite right, and like you're not processing things well. So that's one thing for me, is alcohol definitely will act as a sedative to help me sleep, but ultimately it doesn't make me feel great the next day. And it's like I will wake up earlier, I'll be dehydrated, my brain function, even though I'm kind of feel a little bit of alert and awake, I'm just not functioning correctly. So there's like a bit of there's a separation there between feeling alert and awake in the initial part of the day, and then being able to perform over the course of the day as well. So alcohol stops us really getting into that kind of deep sleep, and having good quality sleep as well. So just be aware of that. I sort of alluded to this earlier. Watch out for consuming caffeine within 8 hours before you go to sleep, minimum. Okay, people go, coffee doesn't affect me anymore. It does. Just because you're not necessarily having the trippy stimulant effects of coffee or caffeine, whether it's an energy drink or coffee, it is still having an effect on your body. it blocks the receptors in our brain that which tell us that it's time to feel tired and time to go to sleep. It blocks the receptors in our brain which tell us that it's time to go to sleep. So as we accumulate fatigue over the course of the day, some of these molecules that are indicative of fatigue, they bind to receptors in our brain, and that's what tells us that like it's time to start powering down. It's natural sleep patterns. What caffeine does is it's what's called competitive inhibition. So it binds to these same receptors, so that but it doesn't have the same fatiguing effect. So that's why we think caffeine isn't having an effect, but it really is. So we need to watch out for that. Another thing that can be a problem for a lot of people is having like big heavy meals later of an evening, particularly if they've got issues around like temperature regulation. So if we have like a one big meal at the end of the day, we get this, and I'm sure most people would be familiar with the meat sweats. It should just be called the big meal sweats, really. And obviously if someone's got digestive system issues or bloating, and again, bloating is another topic that I'm going to talk about, having like a massive meal late in the day is going to sit in your stomach. It's going to slow the digestive system down. And although, you know, in terms of the energetics of fat loss, calories in, calories out type stuff, it's not going to have an impact. The chances are that it will have an impact it will have an impact for some people on the quality of their sleep. So, you know, not immediately before you go to bed. Give yourself a couple of hours before you go to bed if you're going to have most of your calories of like an evening meal, in order to digest and absorb digest and absorb those nutrients. And particularly if you do have things like bloating or, you know, acid reflux or anything like that, you're going to want to make sure that you're not putting a load of digestive system stress, because I'm sure we've all been there where we've had too big of a meal and we're sat there feeling bloated or windy, or like I say, there's a bit of acid reflux. It's like it's going to be quite difficult and challenging to go to sleep if that's the case. Now, obviously we talked about relaxation techniques, and I'm going to talk about those in a bit more detail in a minute. So deep breathing, meditation, even if you're easily distracted by noises, then, you know, white noise or things like even just kind of like something that's been really useful for me personally is I listen to like audiobooks, but like not audiobooks that cause me stress or engage my brain, just like kind of like fact audiobooks, which just kind of, you know, basically just distract my brain enough, and then I kind of just drift off with a very short sleep timer on it. So it's more there in that kind of initial falling asleep phase, but then it just shuts off after like 20-30 minutes, and I know I'm asleep. So you can try all these different things. It's not a one size fits all approach, but we've got to try some approach, and it might fit some of the time. So it's just trying to figure out which of those approaches is the most beneficial to you, really. This is one where we need to be careful of, because there's always, with a lot of these behaviors, there's always a trade-off, right? So this one is exercising during the day, but not too close to bedtime. And the reason for this is as exercise will wake us up. It causes the release of hormones which make us more alert. Okay, so like if you are, you know, I remember when I was a student, we used to pull all-nighters. Like if you were tired, you'd go for like a quick walk around the block, or you'd go for a quick run, or you'd do some press-ups, which was foolish back then, but it was just the way it was done. And now, you know, I'd go and tell my younger version of myself to give my head a wobble, as to use a very Scouse expression, if that was the case. So I appreciate that people are trying to exercise, and exercise is important in terms of people reaching their physique goals, transformation goals. But if we're going to do that later of an evening, we probably just want to try and keep that not as high intensity, not as high effort, unless we don't have a choice. And that's where I'm saying it's understanding your own individual response to this and kind of being your own scientist. Because like for me, for example, if I've got a strength training session to achieve, to tick off my list that week, and I've got to do it later of an evening, then I'm going to do that, and then it's whether that's worth the disruption to my sleep. However, if you have the other sleep structures and systems in place, the chances are that you are still going to sleep anyway. So it's kind of like, just because you've got one of these habits which maybe isn't going to really optimize your pre-sleep routine, the other stuff can kind of accommodate for that and kind of overcome that as well. So like I said at the start, you might not be able to do all of these things, but some of these things for some of you guys might be enough to kind of help with that sleep. And this is really important as well. I think a lot of people do generally have issues around sleep, chronic insomnia, sleep apnea. So if they can't, sleep apnea is like, you know, if you're waking up because you can't breathe because of weight. And there are other sleep disorders as well, which again are where you really should be seeking medical advice and like genuine bona fide sleep experts in this field. Okay. And again, just to reiterate the point, it's important to remember that it might take time to find out what works best for you. So you do have to be a little bit patient and persistent with this. It's kind of like any lifestyle change. It's going to take a period of time in order to get you to where you want to go. So yeah, give yourself the breathing spacing, the care and the courtesy to give yourself the time to do that. So what else can we do about it? So this is, don't worry if you can't read this or it doesn't make any sense. I want to talk about this really quickly. So we're not at a complete loss if we struggle with all these things and if sleep hygiene doesn't work. This is a bit more of like a diagnostic tool. So this is something that I've put together and I've passed on to Lee. And this is a kind of flow chart, if you will, of a flowchart of symptoms and questionnaires and a few other things that will help us identify not just whether you have sleep dysfunction or dysregulation, but specifically what types of sleep dysfunction and dysregulation there might be and what we can do about them. So the first thing on that sheet is what's called the ESS questionnaire, which is the Epworth sleep score. It's the Epworth sleep score. I forgot myself. And it starts with basically you just do it on those situations there, so sitting and reading, watching TV, etc., etc. I'm not going to read a list to you. You score those things, and then that feeds into the sort of flow chart in the middle of the page there as well. So this is a really basic flow chart which will then use a combination of that score and your yes or no answers to those questions to figure out what your course of treatment should be. Okay, so again, I'm not just going to sit here and talk through all of those things. And one of the things that most of those things will highlight is we have to start with that sleep hygiene. So if we're not doing the sleep hygiene stuff, then we're not likely to get the benefits from the other stuff. The other thing that will be asked of you medically, if you really do struggle with your sleep, is this 2-week sleep diary in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen as you look at it there as well. This might be a bit of a pain in the backside to fill out for some people, and it's not an essential thing for a lot of people to fill in. However, if you are really struggling with your sleep and you go to a doctor, GP, sleep specialist, they will probably ask you to fill one of these things out. So it's quite a simple thing to fill out. You just put the day in there, you put when you went to bed, when you woke up, that sort of thing. And then from that, you can then look at your kind of symptoms and management techniques and things like that as well. So on the right hand side of the page there, and you'll see this on the guide that I'll share with you, you will go through your sleep diary and it gives you a list of categories on the left hand side. So under the symptoms, so it says like if any of the following are present from the sleep diary, which is page 4 to 6 on the guide that I will share with you. You then sort of tick the associated boxes. Now the ticking of the associated boxes will then direct you towards potential, and I use the word potential in inverted commas, potential therapies for this as well. So there's things like stimulus control therapy, relaxation therapy, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive therapies, and then there's also things like sleep restriction, bright light therapy of an evening and bright light therapy of a morning as well. Okay, so each of those things is outlined in the guide that I will share with you. So don't worry if that doesn't make sense right now, but I think it's important that the overriding message from this page is if you do struggle with your sleep and it is important to you, like go through this process, follow it through, and start to be able to target the right strategies that are appropriate for you, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And what you will find is when you go down the right-hand side there where it's got all the different management techniques, they all start with the sleep hygiene or the sleep guide. But on the right hand side, what you will see is that for some people, or for many of you, you might tick several of those boxes. If there's anything which is like cognitive therapy based, that probably means that you're going to want to go and speak to somebody who's a psychologist or, again, relevantly medically trained professional. It's easy for me to say, right? So some helpful basics, okay? So these are some of the things that we can do which kind of tie in with the sleep hygiene stuff. So when we talk about somatic tensing or intrusive thoughts that affect sleep, there's loads of stuff that we can do. We can try deep breathing exercises, so that's box breathing. So there's different types of breathing exercises. So one is like you breathe in for 3 seconds, hold for 3 seconds, breathe out for 3 seconds, hold for 3 seconds. What these do, as it might seem, a little bit wishy-washy kind of stuff, but actually what these do is that slowing down of the breathing slows down breathing rate and reduces those stress levels and that kind of internal signaling of stress. We also use things called progressive muscle relaxation. So progressive muscle relaxation, you can start with any limb in the body, and what you do is you start by like really tensing the muscle, squeezing as hard as you can, and then you relax that muscle, and then you start with like from the floor, so you can like grab the floor with your feet, and you can work up through the body, and that's why it's called progressive muscle relaxation. And each time you move up through the body, you just create a moment of tension and relaxation, and it just disperses. The best way I can describe it is it disperses a lot of that stress energy. Okay, again, I also have a guide on this which I will share with you, so don't worry if all of this stuff is kind of like, well, what does this mean? I'm not going to go into too much depth with it right now, because again, it might not be relevant to everybody, but also I do have the guides on all of this stuff which I will share with Lee, so you guys can have a look at it. The other one is visualization. So visualization in this sense isn't visualizing yourself going to sleep, but projecting ourselves into a place or a space where we feel comfortable sleeping. So it might be like, you know, I always think back to like periods of time when I was on holiday on a nice warm beach, just kind of like in the shade, but feeling the heat and the breeze of the beach, the breeze of the sea on the beach. And I would go back and I would visualize that feeling of a position where I felt relaxed and I felt not stressed and I felt happy and comfortable. And that kind of ties in really with meditation. And then there are things like self-hypnosis as well, which is something I don't know an awful lot about, so I'm not going to talk about that, but these are just options that I'm going to give you in terms of reducing that kind of what we call somatic tension. So those are those intrusive thoughts and that stress that really sort of permeates through as we think we're going to bed. We've all seen the memes, going to bed and it's like feeling relaxed, feeling tired, then all of a sudden this thought pops into your head. These are all strategies to help reduce that tension and get those thoughts out of our head. Again, to elaborate on the bedroom thing, let's keep bedrooms for sleep or sexual intimacy. It's quite a nice way of putting that, isn't it? You know, look, I know it's so easy to get onto your phone. I know it's easy to scroll, watching TV. We don't eat there. We don't work there. We don't play computer games there. We're not on our phone. We're not doing Sudoku. We're not doing anything which is going to engage our brain unless we really, 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 really have to. And most of the time, we really, really, really don't have to. And this is a really important one. You know, if we are wake up and get out of bed at the same time. If you're struggling with that, the best thing we can do is get some bright light exposure earlier in the day, especially at weekends, okay? Even if you feel a bit more tired of a weekend, it's probably better, again, it sounds like slightly contradictory, it's probably better to get a little bit less sleep of a weekend and then still get a good, but then your average sleep over the course of the week is increased because you're not into that cycle, into that sort of, you know, minimal sleep, 5-6 hours a night sleep during the week and then 8 hours of a weekend. The averages is what matter really over the long term. So yeah, you know, short term pain for long term gain. So do get up at the same time. If you're struggling with that, then like I say, getting outside, bright light therapy is one of the therapies that's on there, but just getting out and getting some early daylight exposure is one of the things that is often recommended and comes with a recommendation from experts for good reasons, and that's one of them, right? So try and be consistent, pick a time and try and stick with it. This is an important one as well, and I see this a lot, like, is that people sort of try and bludgeon themselves into bed. And yes, there's a certain truth in saying you need to give yourself the opportunity to get enough sleep, like I was saying, bedtimes, but also, like, there's no point going to bed and trying to bludgeon yourself to sleep if you're not fatigued or not tired. So only go to bed when you feel sleepy. I've done this before, like Lee, I run ultra marathons, and I'll have a race that starts at 5-6 o'clock in the morning, and I'll go to bed and like really early to get a full night's sleep, and I'm just not tired, and I end up getting less sleep because I've forced myself to go to bed when I'm not tired. So it's important that even if you feel a bit fatigued or a bit exhausted, like, try and differentiate between those feelings and feeling sleepy. There is a difference there, and like I said, you know, if you go to sleep before that point, you're more likely to engage your brain in those stressful activities. You're more likely to be worried. You're more likely to kind of then let those intrusive thoughts come back in, and you're not gonna sleep. And it is important that if you're not falling asleep within 15 or 30 minutes from when you turn off the lights, when you decide it's bedtime, that, you know, and it extends beyond 30 minutes in particular, I'd probably say, like, and you're still wide awake, there's no form of sleepiness kicking in, then don't be afraid to get up and just go into another room and do something relaxing, and then just go through that cycle, okay? Now, this is a big one because I am a fan of a power nap, don't get me wrong, but I'm only a fan of a power nap, so less than 20 minutes is what I would say a power nap is, 20 to 30 minutes maximum. just to kind of alert the body. I'm a fan of that, but only if people are already sleeping well, and it's just like a little pick-me-up in the day. If you are napping during the day and that is affecting your sleep patterns or ability to go back to sleep, it is of infinitely more benefit to work on getting a full decent night's sleep of decent night's sleep of quality sleep than it is to just kind of consistently live in this sort of half sleep of a night nap cycle. Okay, again, sometimes it's going to be hard to sort of plow through this, and it's going to be hard to stick to this, and we have to give it a bit of kind of self-discipline and motivation and mindset in order to get through this initial phase to reinstill and reintegrate these habits or behaviors. So that's it, guys. Hopefully that has been some use to you. A bit of a whistle-stop tour of sleep there. I don't want to keep you too long. I know it's difficult to concentrate for long periods of time, particularly if you've had no sleep. So everything I kind of rushed through there with the sort of Epworth sleep score, and that sort of flow chart. Don't worry if I sort of whistle through that. You're going to have that as a hard copy anyway to look at. So go through that. If it requests or suggests you keep a sleep diary and it's important to you, do it. And then also don't be afraid to take things a step further. So like I said, there's loads of resources there around meditation, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. There's loads of stuff that I've built into a resource for you guys to use and look at. Try those things, but if they don't work, don't just quit on week one. And also don't feel like it's the end of the line. Like, it's important that you persist and speak to a medically trained professional. Right, guys, so thank you for your time and for your listening, and I will be back with you very soon with another one of my topics. Have a wonderful day, you wonderful humans, and yeah, get some good quality sleep, and I'll speak to you soon.